Hey there, guys. Buckle up because there's a lot that we need to discuss here. There is a ton of weird manipulation of ambiguity in language in Bitcoin right now that has the vast majority of people confused about relatively simple concepts. But I think it's really important that we talk through all of these things. When we say the word Bitcoin, what are we talking about? And really, when we talk about Bitcoin, we're talking about two different things. So this is the first place that we have ambiguity in language when discussing Bitcoin. We have Bitcoin, the token, the money, BTC. There will only ever be 21 million, digital gold, flying through cyberspace, bearer asset, infinitely divisible, cryptographically signed, all that good stuff. We know about this. It's the best money that there's ever been. Then we have Bitcoin, the software that gives us BTC, the money, and the reference implementation for Bitcoin is what is collectively known as Bitcoin Core, the reference implementation for the consensus rules in Bitcoin. And we're going to talk about consensus because that's another problem that we have that we need to talk through. When we talk about Bitcoin, there are two different things that we could be referring to. We could be talking about BTC, the monetary asset, and Bitcoin Core, the software that enforces all of the rules and basically provides the portal for people to access and engage with the Bitcoin network, a distributed consensus or computers talking to each other and figuring out what is the transaction history. What are the rules that every participant in this network agrees to, and has anybody tried to do anything that deviates from those rules? Many people refer to those as consensus rules, but I'm going to elaborate on the word consensus here in a moment. I think hopefully we've made this clear that we can be talking about the Bitcoin network, which is enabled by the Bitcoin software, and we could be talking about the Bitcoin token, which is enabled, again, by the Bitcoin software. Confusing and conflating the economic principles surrounding the tokenomics of Bitcoin is really, really not helpful when you're trying to understand and talk about Bitcoin, the software protocol and network, or implementation for that matter. So we've got Bitcoin Core, the software. We've got like the Bitcoin network, which is really just all of this software mainly. It's like 90% this, probably higher than that if you're talking about economic significance. You've got the Bitcoin network, which is just a protocol. It's a set of rules. Those rules are determined by the reference implementation, by the nature of the fact that this is what most people choose to trust when they use Bitcoin, when they interface with Bitcoin. We have this other term that has a lot of ambiguity with it in Bitcoin, and it's called consensus. When you're talking about consensus, you could really be talking about three different things. You have Nakamoto consensus, you have IETF rough consensus, and you have economic consensus. Again, like the term Bitcoin, this term consensus has a lot of nuance to it, and people very often don't differentiate between the three different nuances of consensus when they're referring to what is consensus in Bitcoin. And it's especially unhelpful if we're not even sure whether or not you're talking about the monetary asset or the software in the network itself when you're talking about, and then you start talking about consensus, and now you're not making it clear which part of consensus you're even referring to. It starts to get really messy really quick, and we can start to like conflate a lot of ideas and miss a lot of nuance and really miss the forest for the trees when it comes to understanding how Bitcoin actually works. So let's go through each one of these one by one and make sure that we understand what each of these are and how each of them are different. So Nakamoto consensus is the way that nodes reconcile asymmetric state in a single source of truth, meaning everybody has all of these copies of the ledger on their computer and certain rules that their node is enforcing. How do we determine what is true? Well, Bitcoin does that using this process of Nakamoto consensus by preferring the longest chain with the most accumulated proof of work. You can only be a part of the longest chain with the most accumulated proof of work if, let's call it only valid in Nakamoto consensus, if you follow the consensus rules of the reference implementation. IETF rough consensus is a change review process used in free and open source software. And a better way of describing IETF rough consensus is the no valid fear change review process. And what this means is that the process is open source, the code base is open source, and anybody can propose to make changes to the code. Usually this is done in the form of like a pull request. It usually starts out as discussion where someone proposes an idea, because usually you're going to debate the idea long before anybody ever writes up any code. But these proposals, they go through this rough consensus change review process where basically anybody that wants to can attack these proposed changes from every different angle that they can think of. And slowly and methodically and one by one, the community of contributors goes through any objection and concern that there is to a proposed change. And once all of the objections and concerns to a proposed change have been addressed thoroughly, and there are no new concerns raised about a proposal, it gets included into the software implementation. If the concerns are not able to be reasonably addressed and thoroughly addressed, then the proposal doesn't get included in the software implementation. The third consensus in Bitcoin is just simply economic consensus, and this is just the market demand or market dominance of a particular chain and its token. You'll hear a lot of people say, like, for example, that there are changes being made in like the Bitcoin's reference implementation that don't have consensus. And this is just a weird, subtle manipulation of language, because changes don't get into Bitcoin Core unless they reach IETF rough consensus. But that is completely extrinsic to whether or not everyone on Twitter likes those changes. Random people's opinions on technical changes, if those people are not contributors to that rough consensus process, and when I say contributors, I don't just mean that like they show up and post messages. I mean that like they're actively engaged in that process of arriving at rough consensus for a proposal, meaning that they're actually involved in the technical discussion, working through the objections to any proposal. To say that there's not consensus for a change is just wrong. Like, it's a misconstruing of what exactly we mean when we say consensus for a change. There's a third topic in Bitcoin that we need to address that is also confusing, that had language that has some ambiguity, and this is the word fork. And all of these three confusing terms, Bitcoin itself, consensus, and now fork, these are all contributing to massive misunderstanding at large, and also what I think is a pretty malicious social crusade to lead people down very strange paths. But anyway, our third term of ambiguity is fork. And traditionally in software, what a fork is going to mean is, particularly in the case of open source software like on GitHub, a fork is just going to mean that you're creating a copy of code. And the reason that you would do this, particularly in an open source project, is if you wanted to make a change to a code base, but you didn't want that change to have to go through whatever the change review process is for that open source code. So in the case of Bitcoin, you would fork Bitcoin Core. If there was a change that you really wanted, that either you didn't want to wait for it to go through IETF rough consensus, or it wasn't able to get through IETF rough consensus, you would fork the code and you would make that change yourself to your own copy of the code instead of having to wait for that IETF rough consensus to get it in. Where the language here is confused is that we have this other meaning for fork in Bitcoin, which is a consensus split. What do I mean when I say a consensus split? Well, when we're talking about a consensus split, what we're really talking about is a coin split, or a segregation of Bitcoin into two separate competing money networks with two separate tokens that have two different transaction histories. The reason that it's really important to differentiate this from this is because you could definitely fork Bitcoin Core and not change anything of all that much significance and not end up with a consensus split. But if you were to go into Bitcoin Core and change consensus rules, which are set by Bitcoin Core in the Bitcoin network because it is the reference implementation, and violating rules that are used in the process of Nakamoto consensus, you will end up with two coins. You will have Bitcoin, the transaction blockchain history that is following the consensus rules of Bitcoin Core, and you would end up with some other coin. What happens when you do this is you end up with what we call a shitcoin, or some other cryptocurrency. Even though this word actually does do a pretty good job as long as you're able to understand the nuance here of explaining what exactly is happening. We have really lost the plot in terms of like what it actually means to fork Bitcoin. And I can go through some examples and really kind of explain why. So let's start with like a well-known example, like Litecoin. So I'm not exactly familiar with all of the changes that Litecoin made, but some of the big ones that I can think of off the top of my head were a proof of work change, target block time, I guess you could say, block time target. So every 2 weeks, Bitcoin readjusts its difficulty to target a certain block time based on the average block time of the last difficulty period. Litecoin adjusted the proof of work algorithm, the block time target, the total supply, and they might have also messed with the block size, but I don't even know. I don't know that that's even accurate. I think that the main things that they changed were just this. They changed the proof of work algorithm from SHA-256 to script, I think, and they changed the block time target from like 10 minutes to like 5 minutes or 2 minutes or something like that. They made it way smaller, and they changed the total supply. It has like 2x or 4x more tokens or whatever. What Charlie Lee did here when he created Litecoin was he just forked Bitcoin Core. He forked Bitcoin Core and made some changes to the consensus rules and then ran the code. This is all you need to do to create a shitcoin. You just have to go into Bitcoin and change the consensus rules and run the code and start creating blocks with that code, which you could do with Bitcoin Core on your computer. You could just go into the settings and make it so that your node is mining with your CPU. You won't have a very competitive hash rate. And in fact, it's going to be like extremely tiny compared to like a bunch of ASICs in a warehouse. But you can still create blocks. Now, people could overwrite those blocks really easily. You could get 51% attack. There's lots of reasons you wouldn't want to do this. And this is probably why Charlie Lee changed the proof of work algorithm right out of the gate, is because he didn't want a risk of all the SHA-256 miners attacking his chain or being so able to easily attack his chain. So one of the things that he did was change the proof of work algorithm. But these are 3 changes that would be really, really difficult to get through the IETF rough consensus change process. And for a lot of good reasons. Like, first of all, there's no good technical justification for why you would make any of these changes. A proof of work algorithm change would be very damaging to the miners because it would basically brick all of their specialized equipment. So miners have to make huge capital investment in application-specific integrated circuit mining machines that are just designed to do one thing, which is to just guess a certain kind of random number over and over and over and over and over until they guess the right one, and then they do it again after the next block. Changing the proof of work algorithm means that those machines that are designed to guess a certain type of number on a certain curve over and over and over, it makes those obsolete. So you would basically be bricking the economic investment of profit-motivated actors that are providing security to your blockchain. So there would be no reason to change the proof of work algorithm, short of some drastic scenario where there was like a really reasonable technical justification for it. You would never want to do this. So Charlie Lee had to fork Bitcoin Core and make this change on his own. The next change would be the block time target again. This is not something that you would want to change because there's good reasons that we have the block time target set to what we have it set to in Bitcoin. You don't want block time targets to be too low because it takes a little bit. Every time a block gets discovered, it has to propagate through the network. So like if a miner is mining and they discover a block, they discover that block and then they have to send it out to everyone else. And because of the way that Bitcoin works, each block contains a hash of the previous block. So it's a chain of blocks that point backward to the previous blocks. In computer science, you could call this like a linked list. You have to, whenever you're trying to discover the next block, you have to make sure that you're building on top of the previous block. With really, really low block times, you're giving an advantage to the larger miners because they can start building on the previous block that they discovered immediately, whereas the rest of the network has to wait for that block to propagate. They have to download it, and then they have to start trying to build on top of it. And this is a small amount of time that this takes, but the lower your block time target, the more of an advantage a small number of seconds make in terms of the competitiveness of larger and smaller miners. So we wouldn't want to change this. So this change would have definitely not gotten through the IETF rough consensus process. So Charlie Lee had to fork it. And then the other thing he changed was the total supply, which obviously most people in Bitcoin are very, very against the idea of changing the total supply. And you ended up with a shitcoin. Now, if Charlie Lee had been a serious person who really, really thought that these were good technical changes that needed to get into Bitcoin because it would improve Bitcoin in some way, he would have tried to get these changes through IETF rough consensus. But it was never the goal to get these changes into Bitcoin because they were good technical changes. These were just Charlie Lee's attempt at confusing the market by making people think that there would be multiple competing Bitcoins with different names. If Charlie Lee had thought that these were really good changes and the Bitcoin Core people just don't know what they're doing and they don't know that we need to make these changes in order to make Bitcoin succeed, he would have tried to keep the name. He would have said, look, guys, we need to make Bitcoin as good as we can. We need to change the proof of work algorithm, change the block time target, and increase the total supply. I'm going to go in and I'm going to make this change to the code because the Bitcoin Core people don't want to do it. Run my code. This is the real Bitcoin. This is the right Bitcoin. This is the right design direction for Bitcoin. But because this was a scam that was designed to target non-technical people who couldn't understand that Charlie Lee's major changes were all stupid, he gave it a different name. And the reason that he did that is because it created this ambiguity that there would eventually be all of these different competing monetary networks, which is just ridiculous. It's a complete fallacy because there's no reason for money to be different things. Money coalesces around one most saleable good because it just reduces the complexity of economic calculation when talking about like what is the value of a unit of account in an economy. You also don't want to fragment networks. Like, it doesn't make sense. You don't want two different competing networks. You want one network because the bigger the network, the more valuable the network. So you don't want to split off into like a ton of tiny fragmented competing networks. And this was like a really big narrative earlier on in Bitcoin's lifespan. There was like this idea, and this idea was perpetuated by this guy named Andreas Antonopoulos, that one day, eventually, everybody would have their own blockchain with their own coin. Everybody would have their own token, millions of competing cryptocurrencies with their own segregated networks and their own segregated security assurances and incentives. And this was just a total fallacy. It was pushed by a guy who really didn't know what he was talking about, especially when it comes to economics. And what we ended up with was this space where it was really ripe for people like Charlie Lee and many other people that came after him to take advantage of the fact that a lot of the people that were interested in Bitcoin were not very technical and didn't understand that like these types of changes are just completely arbitrary. Like, these are not good changes, and that's why they would never be made in Bitcoin. And that's why Charlie Lee had to fork Bitcoin and run his own implementation of Bitcoin. And he changed the name to just deceive people, to just make people think, oh, this is just like a different brand of Bitcoin. This is just some competing implementation of Bitcoin, even though this thing was doomed from the start because these changes are just dumb and ultimately lead to like bad incentives. But let's use another example because it isn't exactly clear that anytime we're talking about cryptocurrencies, like competing cryptocurrencies, we're always talking about the same principle here. Even though some of them are not technically blockchains, like it doesn't really matter. We're talking about competition for an open source global money network. Ethereum did this exact same thing. Now, what Vitalik did was he wrote up a white paper for Ethereum and said that Bitcoin needed a smart contracting language built on top of it that was Turing complete so that you could execute all kinds of complicated scripts on top of Bitcoin and make money truly programmable. Instead of trying to get this idea of his for, I think it's called Solidity. I think Solidity is the name of the language on top of Ethereum. Instead of trying to get Solidity into Bitcoin, which would be the proper thing to do because it's open source. And if this was really a good idea with merit, he would have tried to push this idea through the IETF rough consensus process. But this change would have never made it through the IETF rough consensus process because you would never, ever want a smart contracting language on top of something with a globally distributed asynchronous state like Bitcoin with a Turing complete programming language on top of it. And the reason for that is basically what happened with the DAO hack. Like, the reason that the DAO hacker was able to steal all the money that he did out of the Ethereum DAO, and then Ethereum forked into Ethereum and Ethereum Classic so that they could roll back the chain and give all of the money back to the DAO, was because of the fact that Ethereum was Turing complete. It was a design flaw from the very beginning. So Vitalik probably knew this. I don't know if Vitalik's actually smart enough to know this, but Vitalik is a fraudster. He's always been a fraudster. And his game plan here was to fork Bitcoin and to put in this smart contracting language. So we'll just say his change was Solidity. There were other changes too with how he did ETH, but they're less important here. The other thing that he did, which deviated from the consensus rules, was he changed the transaction history of Bitcoin. So he created this competing Bitcoin implementation called, and he gave it a different name because he knew it was never going to actually compete with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin Core only makes changes that go through this IETF rough consensus process. You can't just make random stupid changes with bad technical side effects to Bitcoin Core because you wouldn't ever be able to get it through that process. But Vitalik said, okay, since we're going to run this like stupid scam with Solidity, this Turing complete smart contracting language on top of Bitcoin, we might as well also erase the transaction history and start from zero, because then we can give ourselves a huge advantage. We can give ourselves like 70% of the supply. So Vitalik gave the ETH Foundation 70% of the supply. and they sold this to early investors. But we have to remember here that Bitcoin, in terms of what it is technically, is it's just a chain of blocks, and each block contains transaction history. So the transaction history really is a part of that Nakamoto consensus. And if you deviate from that transaction history because each block contains the hash of the previous block and points back to it because of the fact that it's a linked list, if you change the transaction history, like you're causing a contentious split in Bitcoin. This is literally just another fork of Bitcoin that makes some change to the Nakamoto consensus rules established by the reference implementation. Another set of like really weird ambiguous terms that we've run into with Bitcoin where this has all gotten really, really bad is when we start talking about the difference between like hard forks and soft forks. People are really confused about this stuff. So for starters, there's this idea that's pushed by like the macroeconomic Bitcoin influencers, the ones that are not technical at all and almost exclusively focus on the monetary side of Bitcoin. They almost exclusively focus on like this BTC token side of things and don't understand really anything about software at all, much less like Bitcoin Core and how distributed systems actually work. There's people that are under this impression that like Bitcoin is just the dominant open source money protocol and the dominant open source money asset because it's the one that hasn't ever forked. But this is completely wrong because every time we upgrade Bitcoin, every time we want to change the consensus rules of Bitcoin, change like what all the nodes agree is and is not a valid Bitcoin transaction, in order to upgrade Bitcoin and improve the types of features that you can access in this open source monetary network, we have to fork. We have to fork the network. And there's a lot of like strange ambiguity that has been created between these terms here. I actually think that these terms are terrible. Like just the other day, I was talking to a guy on Twitter, and I said something along the lines of all the stuff that I just described above, and he said that every fork of Bitcoin has failed, and this is not true, right? So it's true in the sense that every consensus split that has deviated from the IETF rough consensus and the Nakamoto consensus established by Bitcoin Core, which follows this IETF rough consensus process, has failed, right, in the sense that it hasn't captured the economic consensus. There's been successful forks in Bitcoin's history by requirement of the fact that we've needed to upgrade the protocol. Like SegWit 2x, for example, was a fork of Bitcoin. And many would say, whoa, hold on, Hack. Stop right there. SegWit 2x was a soft fork. It wasn't a fork of Bitcoin. It didn't cause a contentious split. We didn't get two coins from SegWit 2x. And this is absolutely true. But the reason for that is just because of the way that they activated SegWit 2x. They used what was called soft fork. So they made changes to the consensus rules in such a way where they tried to make sure that there wasn't going to be any type of consensus split. There would never be a coin split where you ended up with two different competing Bitcoins, two different segmented, fragmented Bitcoin networks, and users would have to decide which one was the better Bitcoin. You want to avoid that. The IETF rough consensus process of Bitcoin Core works pretty furiously to try to avoid that because it introduces risk that we don't want in the Bitcoin network. SegWit 2x was a fork. It was a successful fork of Bitcoin. The SegWit 2x chain is different. So what you need to understand here is that if there had been like some group of Bitcoiners, let's just say that they're not even that wealthy. Let's say that there's a group of 100 Bitcoiners and they only have one BTC between all 100 of them, but they were really, really against SegWit 2x. They could have run code that said that the SegWit 2x change was invalid, and they could have started producing their own blocks that deviated from the SegWit 2x format. So what I mean is that when SegWit 2x was activated, and miners started producing blocks with SegWit 2x inside of it, these guys over here with their one BTC could have said, no, we're not going to build on top of that chain because we don't recognize SegWit 2x as valid. So our nodes, even though this SegWit 2x software just produced a block, we see that block and we're going to reject it and we're going to build on top of. So you have the old history, right? You have like block 1, block 2, and let's just call this block 3, the SegWit block. They're going to say, no, we don't like block 3. We're just going to build on top of block 2, and we're not going to use any SegWit transactions. In that case, this soft fork of SegWit2x would have resulted in a hard fork, meaning that there would have been a consensus split. People get all hung up on talking about like activation here and like what the miners are signaling, but none of that actually matters when trying to understand what we're talking about here when we're talking about forking Bitcoin, forking the Bitcoin network, getting coin splits, and consensus when we're talking about changes that are made to the software. So what you're seeing now is that there are a lot of people out there in Bitcoin that are taking advantage of the fact that people don't understand what a reference implementation is. They don't understand the three different prongs of nuance when it comes to what even is consensus. And they don't even understand what forks are, what the difference between like forking a code base and forking the network and causing a consensus split actually is. People seem to be under the impression that Bitcoin is like something that exists outside of itself, that it's like some ethereal thing that exists apart from the software required to actually facilitate the thing. But this is not the case at all. And like Bitcoin is an evolving technical process. Like in many cases where Bitcoin, in terms of Nakamoto consensus, is the longest chain with the most accumulated proof of work, the IETF rough consensus is like the Bitcoin software chain with the most accumulated technical improvement. You can't stop this process because of the fact that Bitcoin is open source and anyone can fork it. Like I said, anyone can create a copy of the code and make whatever changes they want. You want this process, this Bitcoin core process, to continue to churn because it has gotten us this far. And if you tried to stop it, like if you were successful in stopping it, then you're going to basically just say, okay, let's say we get to the point where Bitcoin Core says, all right, guys, we're just going to ossify the code base and there's no more changes. Well, that very same day, someone can fork it and improve it. And now you have a situation where there might be a lot of technical people that still desire many technical upgrades to Bitcoin. And you're going to have two competing networks. And now not only do you have two competing networks, but you have a loss of trust in the reference implementation. And that can get really, really messy. And that's like the situation that we're staring down the barrel of in Bitcoin right now, where there's so many people that don't understand all of these technical nuances and are being led astray by influencers that are really good at confusing language and are probably leading people towards what is inevitably going to end up being a consensus split. But this is not going to be like Bitcoin Cash. So we went through these other examples earlier about like Litecoin and Ethereum, but what we're dealing with now is like a much more sophisticated attack than anything that we've seen in the history of Bitcoin up until this point, in my opinion. So in my opinion, the closest that we've ever gotten to Bitcoin actually deviating from having all three of the consensus pieces that I mentioned earlier. So we've never had a situation where Bitcoin Core isn't following this IETF rough consensus anymore, and there's like a good change that needs to happen that isn't getting through this IETF rough consensus, and we need to like try to capture this and make some change and split the network and tell people, hey, no, that's not Bitcoin. This is Bitcoin. And in fact, this is exactly what Roger Ver did with Bitcoin Cash. So with BCH, Roger Ver took like a really dumb technical change, which was just to increase the block size. And it wasn't necessarily that increasing the block size in and of itself was like the end of the world. It was that it was a design direction. It was the justification being used for making the decision. It was, hey, we need Bitcoin to scale in order to serve transactions on chain to millions of people around the world. And to do that, we're going to need to continue to increase the block size. And there were lots of problems with this. It became really obvious to all of the people that study distributed systems and study computer science that increasing the block size beyond a certain point would quickly become really unsustainable, and you'd end up with a broken network that no one would be able to use. So this was a really obviously bad technical change. But what Roger Ver did that pretty much none of the other crypto competitors ever did was he took this very seriously, and he tried to convince people that this change to the Nakamoto consensus rules created by Bitcoin Core was actually the real Bitcoin. And in the early days of the Bitcoin Cash fork, especially like prior to it actually happening, Roger was adamant that this was the one true Bitcoin. And that if you wanted to follow along with like the original Bitcoin as given to us by Satoshi, you had to switch to Bitcoin Cash, which just was Bitcoin. And Roger was really, really resistant to even calling it Bitcoin Cash for a long time. He just wanted to call it Bitcoin. But he ended up having to differentiate it as Bitcoin Cash because he didn't have economic consensus, right? Like there were a lot of people, especially in the earlier days of Bitcoin, where many of the participants were much more technically savvy and could understand a bit more of the nuance of what was going on here. Without economic consensus, it wasn't the real Bitcoin. Even if you say that it is the real Bitcoin and you try to co-opt the brand, and this is exactly what Roger Ver did with Bitcoin.com. So anybody that would go to Bitcoin.com, Roger would try to sell them Bitcoin Cash, and he would tell them, hey, buy my Bitcoin Cash. It's actually Bitcoin. This is the real Bitcoin. If you want it, buy this. But if you were running Bitcoin Core, which is the rules established by the reference implementation of Bitcoin. If you're running Bitcoin Core on your node and you tried to buy BCH from Roger and send it to your wallet, your node would say, nah, that isn't real Bitcoin. I don't want that because that doesn't follow the rules and the transaction history enforced by my node. And those rules and transaction history are basically dictated by Bitcoin Core, by the rules created by Bitcoin Core that come as a byproduct of this IETF rough consensus process. So Roger Ver and Bitcoin Cash was the only serious attempt that we've ever had, in my opinion, at actually trying to challenge the dominance of Bitcoin Core as the reference implementation of Bitcoin, meaning as the software implementation that gets to set the rules for what is and is not a valid Bitcoin transaction, because he tried to keep the name. Everyone else was like, no, this is something different. This is just a competing monetary network with its own separate token. It's not Bitcoin. It's not trying to be Bitcoin. It's trying to be the silver to Bitcoin's gold, or I forget what the early marketing terms were for Ethereum, but this stuff was just all marketing that came after really insignificant, stupid code changes to the Bitcoin Core code base. Bitcoin Cash was the only serious attempt to try to co-opt the Bitcoin brand and capture the economic consensus. What we're dealing with now is a much more sophisticated situation where basically we have competing schools of thought. We have people that are saying, look, the Bitcoin Core IETF rough consensus process is compromised. The reference implementation it's a burning ship. We need to get off. We need to go somewhere else. It doesn't even really matter where we go. We can't trust this process anymore. These guys are no good. They're corrupt. We need to go somewhere else. Let's go to Knots. Luke Jess Jr. seems like a good guy. Let's go run his code instead. We need a competing implementation of Bitcoin. Where this inevitably leads is now we have this is really the same situation that we had with Bitcoin Core, where now we have a fork. We have two competing implementations. And really it's only a matter of time until either Bitcoin Core proposes a change to consensus rules, to Nakamoto consensus rules, or Knots proposes a change to Bitcoin consensus rules. And the only thing that has to happen here is that this implementation and all of its users, all the people that run this code, or this implementation and all of its users and the people that run its code have to disagree about this change. And when they disagree about this change, you're going to end up with two competing networks. You're going to have BTC Knots and BTC Core. And I think that this is coming, guys. I think that this is only a matter of time. I'm watching the way that the winds are blowing here. It seems pretty obvious to me that this is a ticking time bomb. And there's a lot of people that don't understand the nuance of what's going on here. And that's why I just want to help clarify the language and help you guys understand what's actually going on. Nodes do not protect the network. Nodes protect the user by making sure that the Bitcoin that you receive doesn't violate whatever the consensus rules are of the implementation that you choose to run. Miners secure the network, but only because they're profit-motivated actors, right? This whole thing only works because of Bitcoin's aligned incentives. The most important takeaway from all of this is the fact that at the end of the day, we have this technical process for making changes to the software. And people can run whatever software that they want. That's kind of the beauty of Bitcoin, is that it's an open source monetary network. And anybody can fork the code, anybody can change the code, anybody can run the code, and anybody can choose what token to buy. At the end of the day, Bitcoin Core is just a process. It's a group of people that decide to contribute to this process to try to make what they think are the best technical changes to Bitcoin. And at no point in that change review process, known as IETF rough consensus, is there room for whether or not a bunch of random people on the internet agree with those changes. It's a strict process that follows a certain technical protocol. But people don't have to run that software. They don't have to use that software. But it's the software implementation that the technical people trust because of the process behind how changes are made in Bitcoin Core. That's the reason that more technical people trust Bitcoin Core, and we're not using Litecoin or whatever. We're not using some alternative implementation of Bitcoin. The market at the end of the day is the one that gets to decide what software to run, what token to buy. Everything else is ultimately irrelevant. Like all this stuff about like nodes, enforcing rules and voting power and all this stuff, like your voting power is your wallet. Your voting power is how much of the token do you want to own? What software that enforces the rule set of that token are you going to run? And everything else is literally just noise. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to answer as many objections and questions as I have time for. Appreciate it.